Welcome to EPG Pathshala. Today we will discuss about thermal pollution. The learning objectives of today's module will be: the students will be able to learn about the basic concept of thermal pollution, the sources of thermal pollution as well as effects of thermal pollution. They will be able to understand the various control measures for thermal pollution. As we know, thermal word is related to heat, that is the heat released directly into the water bodies which affects the aquatic systems. Heat can be considered as a pollutant when it is directly released into any environmental system and adversely affects the health of plants, animals or human beings. So water, as we know, water has a higher heat capacity, and on the basis of this property it can be used as a coolant by various industries. So thermal pollution can be defined as accumulation of any unusable heat from anthropogenic activities that disrupts the ecosystem in the natural environment, or we can say that the accumulation or discharge of any waste heat into the environmental systems which changes the ambient water temperature of the water bodies. So water as a coolant can be used by various industries like thermal power plants, nuclear power plants, paper and pulp mills, steel mills, chemical plants and some coal-fired power plants. So now we will discuss about the sources of thermal pollution. This pollution is caused due to release of waste heat into water bodies, and sources of such kinds include some natural sources like soil erosion and shoreline deforestation. They contribute to thermal water pollution but to a limited extent. As we know, soil erosion means the erosion of top layer of soil which is very fertile in nature. It makes the water muddy, which in turn increases the light absorbed, and thus water temperature of the water bodies is raised. Deforestation of shorelines further contributes to this problem as it increases the soil erosion and also it increases the amount of light that strikes the water and hence helps in increasing the temperature of that water body. Volcanoes and geothermal activities also contributes to the natural thermal pollution which occurs under the oceans and seas. Anthropogenic sources of thermal pollution includes nuclear power plants, as nuclear experiments and explosions discharge a lot of heat along with toxic nuclides into nearby water streams. Emissions from nuclear reactors and processing installations are also responsible for increasing the temperature of water bodies. Heated effluents from power plants are discharged at temperature 10 degrees Celsius higher than the receiving waters and affects the aquatic animals as well as plants. Nuclear power plants requires 30 to 100% more cooling water than other types of plants with a comparable power output. Coal-fired power plants are also contributing to the thermal pollution as they take water from nearby lakes or rivers to cool the condenser coils. That heated water is discharged into lakes and streams, thereby raising their water temperature at least by 15 degrees Celsius. That heated effluent decreases the dissolved oxygen content of water, resulting in the death of aquatic organisms, and that sudden fluctuations of temperature also lead to thermal shock that can kill aquatic life to a large extent. Globally, over 46% of the thermal emissions into rivers are due to coal-fueled power plants, and for example, in countries like United States, China and France are with the highest riverine thermal emissions, occupying shares of 26%, 16% and 12% of the global thermal emission rate respectively. Thermoelectric power plants are also one of the main causes of thermal pollution. Such plants pump water directly from river, lakes or oceans to cool the turbine condensers. During this process, which usually involves once through cooling, the water becomes warmer than the source water so that the wastewater is returned to its source at a temperature significantly higher than the normal fresh water. Industrial effluents are another source of thermal pollution as industries like textile, paper, sugar and pulp manufacturing discharge large amounts of cooling water along with the effluents into nearby water bodies. That heat contained in effluents from wastewater treatment plants can also lead to significant increase in the stream temperature, and release of sudden and massive organic loads results in drop in levels of dissolved oxygen which affects the aquatic life as lots of marine animals and aquatic animals are totally dependent on oxygen for their breathing process. Sewage Domestic sewage is discharged into rivers, lakes or streams with minimal or without any treatment. These wastes having a higher temperature and organic load lead to decrease in dissolved oxygen content as the industrial effluents, and that dissolved oxygen content of receiving waters reduces and causes some anaerobic and anoxic conditions, resulting in sudden death of aquatic organisms. Hydroelectric power, although it contributes to a small extent to thermal pollution, but we cannot neglect its impacts, as generation of hydroelectric power sometimes leads to a negative thermal loading in river water systems. Dams may change a river habitat into a lake habitat by creating a reservoir behind the dam. The reservoir water temperature is often colder than the original stream or river. On the other hand, downstream of the dams has generally warm water than the upstream because of passing of water from pipelines, turbines and other cooling systems. Now we will discuss about the impact of thermal pollution. There are many impacts of thermal pollution on physical chemical properties of water as well as on aquatic organisms. This figure depicts the effects of thermal pollution like decrease in dissolved oxygen content, algal metabolism, increases the algal photosynthesis and toxicity to anaerobes, reduction of metals and toxicity to higher organisms, which leads to sudden death of the aquatic organisms. Now we will discuss the various impacts one by one. First of all, the reduction in dissolved oxygen. Solubility of gases decreases with increase in temperature. The decrease of DO can create suffocation for the plants and animals such as fish, amphibians and copepods, which may give rise to anaerobic conditions. Also, warmer waters favor algae to flourish on the surface of water, hence cause the problem of algal blooms. Increased temperature may not be tolerable for aquatic organisms as it increases microbial growth, which in turn decreases the dissolved oxygen content. Survival of juvenile fish can also be reduced due to the increase in temperature in nearby water bodies. Toxicity is also increased due to thermal pollution. The increase in metal compounds combined with the reduced dissolved oxygen content and increased temperatures make the conditions toxic for higher animals. For example, a mass fish killing in any water body. So with the constant flow of high temperature discharge from industries, there is a huge increase in the toxins that are being discharged into the natural water bodies. These toxins may contain chemicals or radiations that may have harsh impact on the local temperature of waters. And for example, a 10 degrees Celsius increase in temperature of water doubles the toxicity effect of potassium cyanide, while 80 degrees Celsius rise in temperature triples the toxic effects of orthoxylene, causing mass mortality of fish. Disturbance of biological activity. The increase in temperature of water bodies due to thermal pollution also increases the amount of toxins that are being discharged from the industries. So, many aquatic species are sensitive to small temperature changes as 1 degree Celsius that may cause significant changes in organism metabolism and also affects the adverse cellular biology. Changes in environment may cause certain species of organism to shift to other places because of warmer waters. For example, in southeastern Brazil, thermal discharges from nuclear power plants decreases the benthic cover, and consequently it changes the associated rocky reef structure and fish assemblage. Thermal pollution also interferes in the reproduction of the aquatic animals. In the fishes, several activities like nest building, spawning, hatching, migration as well as reproduction depends on a very optimum temperature range. Due to thermal pollution, the temperature gradient of water bodies gets disturbed and hence affects whole aquatic organisms. Excessive temperature can cause the release of immature eggs or can prevent normal development of certain eggs. For example, premature hatching of eggs by artificially raised temperatures may lead to mass mortality of the young fish through starvation. Mass killing of fishes and other aquatic organisms can occur when there is a very rapid change in water temperature, and this is known as thermal shock. Here in this picture, we can see a mass fish killing floating on the surface of water body due to thermal shock, that is due to sudden increase in the temperature of the water body. Then ecological impacts. The increased temperature can also increase the solubility of substances toxic to organisms. A continuous exposure to heat leads to development of a new ecosystem comprising of a thermally adapted species. Natural migration of fish is also affected due to formation of thermally polluted zones which act as barrier to the migration, and sudden stoppage of industrial plants will again disturb the ecosystem as for example, thousands of warm water fishes and other animals were found dead when a thermal power plant in New Jersey, USA was stopped for repairing for one day in February 1972. Metabolic rate is also increased due to thermal pollution. As thermal pollution increases the temperature of the water bodies, it also increases the enzyme activity in the organisms, and as a result, the organism consumes more food than normal requirement. It disrupts the stability of food chain and alters the balance of species composition and may also lead to faunal migration. As a result, the original species may migrate away and alien species may enter a local aquatic system. For example, increasing warming, that is plus 3 degrees Celsius rise, can cause different interspecific changes in lactate dehydrogenase activity in glycolytic pathways by increasing its activity in Squaleus carolitterati fish and decreasing in Squaleus torgarensis respectively. Thermal pollution also causes loss in biodiversity as increase in temperature of waters leads to exhaustion of microorganisms. Mass fish kills occurs on a surface water body. The species composition changes as species tolerant to warmer water gets replaced with those that are unable to adapt. This transition leads to an overall decrease in species richness of that water body. Food shortage for fish also occurs, and due to abrupt changes in the temperature which alters the seasonal variation, which is shortage of right food for the fish at the right time. The warmer water also increases the metabolic rate of fish, as we already discussed, which leads to a sharp decrease in the life expectancy of aquatic insects. With the lack of those aquatic insects, the fish faces shortage of food. Thermal stratification is also caused by the thermal pollution, especially in the winter months. Winter months has more drastic consequences for the lake thermal regime than the same pollution in the summer months. The heat released into the lake in the winters at environmental temperatures below 4 degrees Celsius mixes down through the water column and remains stored in the lake hypolimnion throughout the subsequent summers. It alters the seasonal mixing regime of that area. Now we will discuss the standards of thermal pollution, as Central Pollution Control Board, that is CPCB 2015 in India, has specified the standards for thermal discharges from thermal power plants. The condenser cooling water should not have temperature more than 10 degrees Celsius higher than the intake water temperature. Thermal water pollution can be avoided by pre-cooling the warmer water prior to its discharge into nearby water bodies. The major principles involved in heat loss are conduction, convection, radiation and evaporation. There are many methods to control the thermal pollutions in water bodies before their discharge, like cooling towers. Cooling towers, the use of water from water systems for cooling purposes with subsequent return to the waterways after passage through a condenser, is called cooling process. Cooling towers transfer heat from hot water to the atmosphere by evaporation. In a cooling tower setup, most of the absorbed heat is removed via evaporation process and is dissipated into the atmosphere. The cooling towers may be of two types, that is wet cooling tower and dry cooling tower. Wet cooling tower, hot water coming out from the condenser or reactor is allowed to spray over baffles, and the cool air with high velocity is passed from the sides, which takes away the heat and cools down the water. In dry cooling tower, the hot water is allowed to flow in long spiral pipes. Cool air with the help of a fan passed over these hot pipes, which cools down the hot water. This cool water then can be recycled or reused or can be discharged into the nearby water bodies. Cooling ponds are the best way to cool thermal discharges. Heated effluents on the surface of water in cooling ponds maximize dissipation of heat to the atmosphere and minimize the water area and volume. So cooling ponds are the large areas which can be constructed nearby the industries, in which they can store the water for 1 to 2 days, and after cooling or after dissipation of its heat to the atmosphere by evaporation process, it can be discharged back into the river water or it can be reused or recycled. Spray ponds. In spray ponds, the water coming out from the condensers is allowed to pass into the ponds through sprayers. Here water is sprayed through the nozzles as fine droplets. Heat from the fine droplets gets dissipated into the atmosphere as its area is maximized and the water is cooled in a fast process. Artificial lakes are man-made water bodies that offer once through cooling process. These lakes are also very helpful for normalizing the temperature of hot water. We can recycle the used water. If the recycling of the used water is started in plants and factories, the problem of thermal pollution can be effectively reduced. Afforestation can be done along the banks of rivers, seas and other water bodies. The trees around the sources of water helps in absorbing the harsh sun rays coming from the sun and prevent them from falling directly upon the water and inhibit the heating of water bodies, that is the natural thermal pollution. Public awareness can also be helpful in reducing thermal pollution, because making more and more people aware about the problem of thermal pollution will be very beneficial. Group discussions of people with different plants and industries can be done to talk about the effects of thermal pollution on aquatic life as well as on other environment. Alternative cooling agents can also be used instead of water. The primary reason behind use of water as a coolant is its easy availability and disposal. However, the heated water disturbs the ecosystem of water bodies, hence emphasis should be laid on the using coolants other than water. For example, air-cooled systems are the best alternative to water-based cooling systems. So with all of these alternatives, or we can say the cooling processes, we can control the thermal pollution before they discharge into the water bodies. So in this module, we have discussed about the basic concept of thermal pollution, that how various kinds of industries and power plants are discharging their waste heat and effluents directly into the nearby water bodies and thereby increasing their ambient temperature. As increase in temperature can cause various changes in the water bodies and affects the aquatic life. As we have discussed, it decreases the dissolved oxygen content in water, increases the toxicity of the water bodies, and as well as causes mass fish killing, which is due to sudden change in temperature due to thermal shock. Increased temperature also alters the physical, chemical and biological properties of the water bodies, as well as causes many changes in the aquatic life. So as the reproductive capacities of the fishes like spawning, hatching and other processes are also affected due to thermal pollution, it changes the entire aquatic ecosystem of the water body. So it can also lead to the more photosynthesis process and the development of more plants, and more live plant means it seems as a good process at first glance, but more live plants means more dead plants which are piled up at the bottom of the water bodies and increases the biological oxygen demand, as more bacterial population will grow and which utilize the oxygen to decompose that organic matter, and more biological oxygen demand cannot be afforded in the water bodies, as thermal pollution already reduces the dissolved oxygen content in the water body. So due to all these adverse impacts like increase in toxicity, reducing the dissolved oxygen content and the mass fish killing in the water bodies, the control of thermal pollution is required, and we can control it by using cooling towers, by using cooling ponds like dry cooling tower, wet cooling tower, artificial lakes. All these can be used in the industries before discharge of their waste or heated effluents into the water bodies. So this is very necessary because entire aquatic ecosystem is affected due to the thermal pollution, and we can take steps like mass awareness or legal management to reduce the thermal pollution. Thank you.